A woman dressed in a lightweight deerskin tunic strode down the gray, hard-packed earth of a footpath clearly delineated by man-made ditches on either side. She carried a bundle of firewood, and behind her others brought baskets of acorns and wild onions. As she walked, she passed several square-shaped huts with brown wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs of dried leaves and grass. Above, several columns of smoke emanated from this village, including from outdoor earthen ovens. These gray wisps climbed above the dark forest trees that surrounded the huts. In front of one hut, a girl chopped wood. At another, an elderly man smashed acorns with a heavy stone. And in the back of another hut, a group of men sat with bows over their shoulders and bags of arrows at their feet. This woman's hut was the third on the left when entering the village from the north, and upon arriving she immediately and excitedly set out on a project she had been waiting several days to complete. Stepping down onto the dirt floor of her home, she gingerly picked up a pot of clay. It was as wide as her shoulders, with a much narrower flat base and several rows of elegant raised bands near the rim. She had formed this vessel 5 days earlier and left it to dry, and now it was finally time to complete its production. She took it outside, placed it upside down in a shallow pit ringed with stones, and began piling firewood around it. The fire would have to burn for several hours, all afternoon. She would continually stoke the fire, making sure the pot never escaped the scalding heat. Eventually, she allowed the fire to die down, covered the pot in warm coals, and left it to slowly cool overnight. In the morning, she pulled it out from the ash, examined it for cracks, tapped it, and listened to see if the clay had been fully and evenly transformed into ceramic. She knew from previous disappointments that success was not guaranteed, but if the pot could indeed hold water, she would have a beautiful new vessel in which to simmer her venison stew. This woman lived 13,000 years ago in a small region of southern Japan, where hunter-gatherers began settling down into semi-sedentary camps, only one of several early pottery-making societies in East Asia. Welcome to Our Prehistory, Episode 34, Invention of Pottery. For the small bands of hunter-gatherers living in Northeast Asia, the Last Glacial Maximum had been a time of struggle, migration, and population decline. Amidst the hardships created by the aridity and the cold, microblades were invented. As easily portable components of efficient spear points, these tiny stone tools possessed ideal qualities for people whose lives depended on successfully hunting animals like reindeer, gazelle, and horse. By 20,000 years ago, microblades were used by people from central Siberia to Japan. But when the respite at the end of the Last Glacial Maximum arrived, around 19,000 years ago, and the world began to thaw, human life was no longer balanced on a knife's edge. Large numbers of people migrated northward into Siberia from East Asia as the population grew once again. Under new conditions, new inventions appeared. Whereas microblades had made the exploitation of large animals more reliable, post-glacial technologies facilitated the use of a wider range of resources. One of these new inventions was among the most important in human history, an invention that would eventually contribute to societal transformations that shaped the modern world: the invention of pottery. For a long time, prehistorians believed that pottery first appeared in sedentary, agricultural societies. However, in the past 3 decades, discoveries of very old pottery in South China, Japan, and far southeast Russia have shown that the first people to use containers made of fired clay were actually nomadic hunter-gatherers. In all 3 regions, people made pots by at least 16,000 years ago. Interestingly, in each case, the appearance of pottery coincides with a range of other fascinating changes. In today's episode, we'll explore the first pottery-making cultures, learn about economic and technological developments at the end of the Pleistocene, and try to explain the forces that led to the adoption of ceramic vessels. Before we begin that journey, let's take a short tangent to understand the advantages and disadvantages that pottery offers over other types of containers. For hundreds of thousands of years before the invention of pottery, hunter-gatherers had probably been using baskets made from plant fiber, bags made from animal skins and organs, and bowls carved from wood, ivory, and stone. Baskets and bags would have been used primarily to carry stuff, but also occasionally to store and cook food. Light and sturdy, those containers were ideal for a rough life of foraging and hiking. In comparison, pottery is not ideal for transportation, given its weight and tendency to break. So what could have attracted a nomadic group of people to make and use such a heavy, fragile material? Archaeologists believe that the major advantage pottery had over other prehistoric container technologies was its capacity to be exposed to fire without burning, making it easier to cook food by boiling. Before the invention of pottery, people boiled water by dropping hot stones into a basket or bag filled with water, a relatively inefficient technique known as stone boiling. In comparison, placing a pot directly over a fire requires less effort and fuel. Ceramic containers effectively expanded the culinary options available to humans, especially for foods that were made palatable by long periods of cooking, such as grains, legumes, and other plant foods, including some acorns, which are toxic before boiling. Also, extended boiling can be used to render fat from animal bones. In other words, pottery made it easier to eat certain plant foods and to extract additional nutrients from animal foods. This capacity may have improved the health of groups that first adopted pottery. Well before the invention of pottery, many hunter-gatherer tribes understood that clay became hard when exposed to enough heat. In fact, 2 different Upper Paleolithic cultures in Europe used this knowledge to produce small ceramic figurines. But the first people to use this information to create ceramic containers lived in South China, in the mostly forested basins of the Yangtze and Pearl rivers. The oldest known pottery has been discovered at a handful of caves where deer hunters made short-term camps. Archaeologists don't agree on the date of these remains, but the oldest pots are either 20,000 or 18,000 years old. This means that pottery was invented either during the Last Glacial Maximum or soon after it ended. The first pots were simple and made in small numbers. Often, at the earliest sites, the remains of a single pot are found. Small, crudely made, with uneven, thick walls, this was clearly nascent technology. Low firing temperatures suggest that they were placed in open bonfires instead of in a purpose-built oven or kiln. An 18,000-year-old pot from a site called Yuchanyan was reconstructed from dozens of fragments. It's estimated to have been 29 centimeters tall and conical, with a pointed base and a wide-open mouth, which was about 31 centimeters in diameter. Pointed and round-based pots often appealed to hunter-gatherers in prehistoric and recent times, probably because they were less prone to cracking when exposed to extreme heat, compared to flat-based pottery. Pots with flat bases contain weak points created by the intersection between the base and the sides. The oldest pottery of South China had little decoration. Some had plain exterior walls, while others had parallel striations made by a scraping tool resembling a comb or fork. In other cases, pots were marked by cords, which might have been wrapped around paddles used to form the pots. These types of comb and cord marks were found on early pottery across Asia. In some cases, it's clear that they were used for decorative purposes when arranged in patterns. However, experimental archaeologists believe that these treatments also served functional purposes, including improving the pot's handling, ability to transfer heat, and resistance to thermal shock. Despite the relatively simple nature of early Chinese pottery, it may have been part of a significant shift in hunter-gatherer life. As people were inventing pottery along the Yangtze and Pearl rivers, they also adopted other technologies. Tools were increasingly made of bone and shell. Bone points, harpoons, needles, and spades, along with knives made by polishing the edges of large shells, appeared at camps in South China after the end of the Last Glacial Maximum. Other new tools included large stones shaped like hoes and cobbles with a central hole. The former either served to chop or dig, and the latter as a weight, either for fishing nets or digging sticks. This burst in innovation corresponds with the exploitation of new types of food resources, specifically those from aquatic environments. Organic remains preserved in the caves inhabited by these pot makers demonstrate that although deer remained their primary source of meat, fish, shellfish, and wild rice were also eaten. Archaeologists have theorized that pottery was invented in China because people needed a more efficient way to boil fish, shellfish, and the wild ancestor of rice. However, the current data is not precise enough to describe in detail the chronology of these changes and correlate them with environmental and demographic trends. Regardless, pottery was a part of a larger societal shift in the way people interacted with their environments. In fact, pottery remained a consistent but minor element of hunter-gatherer life in this region for thousands of years. The second region of East Asia where early pottery emerged is Japan. Currently, the oldest known Japanese pottery is 16,700 years old, placing it at least 1,000 years after the oldest pottery in South China. Due to the absence of early pottery in between these two regions, which are separated by more than 1,000 kilometers, many archaeologists believe that this was an independent invention made without knowledge of Chinese pottery. However, others disagree. The invention of pottery in two different regions of East Asia, 4,000 years before it appeared anywhere else in the world, seems to them like too much of a coincidence. Japanese pottery appeared first on the central island Honshu. From there it spread northward and southward to the rest of the archipelago. The oldest pots were plain and small, much like in South China. Shaped like small bowls with round bases, ceramic vessels were, at first, made in small numbers. And yet, despite their initial simplicity and rarity, the presence of pottery coincided with wider changes in Japanese culture. These changes were part of the evolution of the Paleolithic into a new prehistoric period, known as the Jomon, which would last for 14,000 years, well into the Holocene, and only ended with the appearance of rice agriculture. The Jomon period can be broken into different phases, and the first of these, known as the incipient Jomon, begins with the invention of pottery and continues until the end of the Pleistocene, about 5,000 years later. Besides pottery, the start of the incipient Jomon is also associated with chipped and polished stone axes, which appeared in Japan for the first time in more than 10,000 years, suggesting an increasing importance of woodworking. Furthermore, microblades would eventually disappear from the toolkits of foragers. This occurred first in northern Honshu, where pottery was invented. But by 12,000 years ago, microblades had also disappeared from Hokkaido in the north and Kyushu and Shikoku in the south. In place of tools and weapons armed with tiny microblades, the foragers of the incipient Jomon developed skills in the knapping of larger bifacial stone points. Bifacial points have flakes removed from both faces of the stone. In Japan, this was done using pressure flaking to carefully create symmetrical leaf-shaped points, sometimes with sawtooth edges or narrow stems at the bases. The use of axes, pottery, and leaf-shaped points in Honshu around 16,000 years ago marks the beginning of major changes to Japanese society that would only intensify at the start of the bowling allarod, when the northern hemisphere, including East Asia, experienced a dramatic warming. As temperate forests of oak, beech, and chestnut spread northward and replaced meadows and cold conifer forests around 14,700 years ago, the Jomon started using pottery more frequently and in larger quantities. Camps discovered from this period often have the remains of dozens of ceramic vessels. These pots were larger than those made before the bowling allarod, and different shapes were produced, including ones with flat and nipple-shaped bases. Furthermore, distinct styles of ornamentation emerged, the oldest of which is known as linear relief, in which several thin strips of clay were added to create elevated lines around the pot's rim. Another style that became popular slightly later consisted of making fingernail imprints over the entire outer surface. Even later, toward the end of the bowling allarod, cord impressions, like those on early pots in South China, were often used to decorate Japanese pottery. In fact, these cord marks are what gives the name to this culture. Jomon means cord in Japanese. Interestingly, as pottery styles changed over time, they did so across the span of the Paleo-Honshu Island. This is in stark contrast with the stone tools of the time, which, just as during the Last Glacial Maximum, remained regionally distinct. So where differences in the shapes of stone spear points were used to differentiate between Japanese tribes, pottery styles indicate the presence of long-distance social ties across this large island. Beyond the increase in pottery production and the development of decorative styles, the bowling Alarod also witnessed other interesting technological changes. First, there's a clear shift from larger to smaller stone points. Archaeologists interpret this as a shift from spears to bows and arrows. This conclusion is supported by the appearance in southern Paleo-Honshu of arrow shaft straighteners, pieces of sandstone with circular grooves. The arrowheads of the incipient Jomon came in several regional varieties, from leaf-shaped to triangular and stemmed, but like the larger spear points were bifacial and carefully shaped using pressure flaking. The shift to bows and arrows mirrors a simultaneous transition seen in Europe during the Azilianization phenomenon of the bowling Alarod. In both Europe and Japan, these weapons were probably more suited toward the hunting of animals in forested environments. Another parallel with European Azilianization is the decline in Japan of long stone blade tools and an increase in short flake ones. Much like this period in South China, the bowling Alarod witnessed changes in the economy of Japanese hunter-gatherers, reflected in the types of food they ate and their movements across the land. Specifically, there may have been an increase in the use of aquatic and plant foods. It's hard to make this statement definitively because organic remains are so rare at sites both before and after the invention of pottery. However, across Paleo-Honshu, people used grinding stones to process plant foods more often. Both large heavy slabs and smaller mortars and pestles have been found alongside the remains of chestnuts, acorns, and other plant foods. There are also signs that people were consistently exploiting aquatic food during the incipient Jomon. The remains of fish bones and shellfish have been found at these sites, including one that was overwhelmingly dominated by salmon bones, suggesting that some Jomon groups set up riverside camps exclusively dedicated to fishing. Furthermore, fishhooks have been discovered at 2 sites, the oldest known examples on Paleo-Honshu. Finally, evidence for the cooking of fish comes from a study published in 2018 that has been key to our understanding of early pottery use. This study conducted chemical analyses on food residues from 176 incipient Jomon pots from 11 different sites, and found overwhelming evidence that these pots were used primarily for cooking aquatic foods, including both marine and freshwater. This study provides clear evidence that there was a strong cultural association between pots and fish. It should be noted that most of the pots in this study were limited to those used at the end of the incipient Jomon, and that separate studies from other sites have found residue from both terrestrial animal meat and nuts on pottery shards, suggesting that there was some variation in the use of pottery. Another notable shift in Japanese society during the bowling Alarod was their settlement and movement patterns. Across Honshu, people increasingly made camps on the banks of rivers and lakes, again suggesting a greater use of aquatic resources. Also, cultural remains at these sites grow in quantity, reflecting a higher occupational intensity. In other words, forager bands were living at camps for longer before moving, or were returning more frequently to those same camps. In fact, the Jomon began a practice of setting up caches containing dozens of stone points, stored in preparation of a return to specific locations. These behaviors likely reflect a growing human population, and bands that were likely being constrained to smaller territories. The most extreme example of increasing occupational intensity occurred at the southern tip of Paleo-Honshu, on what is now the island of Kyushu. The region on the Pacific coast experienced the warmest and wettest climate of anywhere on the island, and thus harbored the most productive temperate forest. Around 13,500 years ago, during the second half of the Bowling Alarod, a society emerged in which people became semi-sedentary. Evidence for this way of life comes from several sites where considerable infrastructure was constructed, including multiple pit houses, stone-lined hearths, storage pits, and earthen ovens full of burnt stone clusters. Some of the hearths were connected to underground ducts used to channel smoke, probably for preserving meat. Heavy grinding stones in southern Kyushu bear starch grains from acorns, which were processed through labor-intensive leaching and grinding. At one site, the charred remains of acorns and wild onions were found alongside a pot with meat residue, which has raised the possibility that this society was using pottery to cook stews. The largest pot from one of these sites had a capacity of 16 liters. The relative permanence of these structures, along with evidence of intensive food processing and storage, suggests that some of these were occupied for many months at a time, if not year-round. The most spectacular of these semi-sedentary camps, known as Ueno-haru, rose to the size of a small village. This site was occupied on 4 separate occasions, and each time around 13 houses were constructed on either side of a central path, lined by ditches. Likely housing around 60 people at a time, the inhabitants of Ueno-haru dug dozens of pits and built dozens of stone ovens and fire pits. Some hearths placed inside homes were designed to carry smoke to an exterior smoker via underground channels. As interesting as this culture in southern Japan is, we should remind ourselves that it's not representative of the incipient Jomon as a whole. Partial sedentism should not be used to explain the origin of pottery in Japan. Pottery was still primarily used by people who moved from camp to camp many times per year. Ueno-haru was a case of rare, budding sedentism in Japan, well before the transition to the Holocene. In fact, subsequent events demonstrate that this way of life was fragile. Camps and villages like those of Ueno-haru disappeared when the cold Younger Dryas hit around 12,800 years ago. Crossing the Sea of Japan from Paleo-Honshu to mainland Asia, we find the third region where early pottery-using cultures emerged. This was the basin of the Amur River, which today separates Russia from China. Most early pottery sites lay on the Russian side, but a few have also been discovered in China. And importantly, nearly every one is located directly on the course of the Amur or one of its major tributaries, including some on river islands. One cluster of sites on the lower section of the Amur belong to the Osipovsky culture, and 600 kilometers upstream on the middle Amur, a second contemporaneous but less well-studied pottery-using culture emerged, known today as the Gromatuka culture. The oldest known pots of the Osipovsky are 15,900 years old, only 800 years younger than those of Japan. Much like the incipient Jomon, the Osipovsky and the Gromatuka lasted until the end of the Pleistocene. They also share striking material similarities, including the use of grinding stones, polished stone axes, bifacial leaf-shaped spearheads and arrowheads, and arrow shaft straighteners, suggesting that these cultures, whose people still also used microblades, were undergoing a similar transformation as those in Japan. Another important artifact type found at Osipovsky camps are river pebbles with a perforation drilled through the center. These are believed to have been used as weights on fishing nets. Furthermore, archaeologists have theorized that the axes that appeared along the Amur were used by people to build wooden canoes, from which fishing nets were deployed. The Osipovsky were river people, with strong links to the Amur. In fact, food resources from shards at 3 Osipovsky sites show that they used pots to cook salmon, which spawn in the Amur River from late spring to early autumn. At one site, figurines carved in the form of fish illustrate the prominent role of fishing in this society. The relationship between the Osipovsky and Jomon cultures is unclear. Their appearance around the same time, with similar stone tool technologies, might suggest a common origin. But again, like the connection between South China and Japan, the link between early pottery-using cultures in the Amur Basin and in Japan is vague, leaving many archaeologists to consider the idea of a third, independent invention of pottery. The early Russian pots don't show any obvious similarities to those of China or Japan. Much like other early pottery-using societies, pots were made in small numbers at the camps along the Amur. Interestingly, Osipovsky pots had flat bases. Some bore the impressions of woven objects, leading to the hypothesis that woven baskets served as molds in which to form clay pots. Another type of distinctive marking were zigzag patterns made by scraping the surface with a comb-like tool. Further up the Amur River, the people of the Gromatuka culture created a distinct pottery tradition, which included both flat and round-based pots, and in which the most common impressions were made by cords rolled on a stick. Gromatuka pots were typically small, 20 to 30 centimeters tall, and in contrast to those of the Osipovsky, they had large amounts of plant fiber mixed in with the clay. Plant material used like this is referred to as temper, and serves the function of preventing pots from cracking during firing. In the other regions of East Asia, potters used different materials as temper, such as sand or crushed rock. Different tempers can alter the physical characteristics of the ceramic. During this early phase of pottery making, East Asian foragers were experimenting with different methods of making pottery. Learning about the need for an effective temper and finding the correct material and amounts was a necessary step in the creation of watertight containers. Our survey of the 3 oldest pottery-making cultures now complete, let's take a stab at explaining the appearance of this technology in East Asia, beginning with the things we know for certain. First, the oldest pottery in East Asia was clearly used to cook, as seen by charring on the outer surfaces and food residues on the inner surfaces. From its inception, ceramic bowls and pots were thought of as cooking utensils. Second, the invention of pottery is not clearly associated with any major climate changes. The oldest pots in China, Japan, and Russia were made before the rapid rise in temperature of the bowling allarod, when the climate resembled that of other periods of the Upper Paleolithic. Even if later increases in pottery production in Japan were correlated with warming, the original invention can't be explained by environmental or demographic changes resulting from climate. Third, in all three cases, pottery was invented and used for thousands of years by nomadic hunter-gatherers. The one exception is the small area in southern Kyushu where semi-sedentism temporarily emerged, but everywhere else, pottery was manufactured by forager bands that moved often between temporary camps. Therefore, ceramic containers were not invented in East Asia as a byproduct of sedentism or of agriculture. They appealed to nomads despite their unsuitability for travel. It's possible that early potters considered these containers to be disposable, or cached them for use upon returning to certain camps. Furthermore, it's worth reiterating that for several thousand years after its invention, pottery remained a minor component of cooking equipment, suggesting that there were still significant limits to its utility. Fourth, and finally, in South China, Japan, and the Amur Basin, the invention of pottery was accompanied by other social changes. Notably, the appearance of stone axes, suggesting increased woodworking, the increased use of plant foods, as seen in the presence of grinding stones, and the increased dependence on aquatic resources, as seen in the appearance of harpoons, fishhooks, and net sinkers. Based on this information, a common theory to explain the invention of pottery is that people needed containers in which to boil either plant foods, shellfish, or fish, which they were consuming in increasing quantities. This idea is further elaborated by proposing that the concentration of large groups of people around fixed resources, such as at rivers during salmon spawning season, may have created ideal conditions for pottery making by providing extended stays at a single camp with easy access to clay sources at riverbanks at times when large amount of food was being procured in a short period. Another popular theory for the origin of pottery argues that these vessels carried powerful symbolic significance among their early users. Specifically, pottery may have originally been a novelty, an object viewed with some level of amazement, essentially artificial stone molded by human hands. Perhaps the first pots were simply serving vessels at feasts or other ceremonies, and valued by influential individuals as tokens of their position within the tribe. The use of early pottery at feasts may explain their association in some cases with intensive salmon fishing. The use of pottery as items of prestige might also clarify why the earliest pots were relatively small and rare. And yet, neither the symbolic nor the functional theory of pottery invention really answer the question of why East Asia. Unsatisfyingly, it's hard to find anything especially unique about this place and time compared to other parts of the world. A general widening of the diet was occurring in many places around the world after the last glacial maximum. In Europe, people were fishing more often, based on the increased sophistication of fishing technology with the invention of harpoons around 16,000 years ago, and then fishhooks around 2,000 years later. Yet, this was not associated with the invention of pottery. As the world was approaching the fateful start of the Holocene, human cultures wandered along distinct paths at opposite ends of the Eurasian continent. In our next episode, we will finish the Pleistocene of Northeast Asia by following the next phase in the spread of pottery and the post-glacial movement of people across Siberia. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a patron of the show. Your support will allow me to continue bringing you our prehistory.